All right, thank you for that introduction. So as I mentioned, this talk is going to be reassessing the sort of traditionally attributed Scandinavian influence on early medieval Irish warfare. So let's start by sort of giving what the orthodox view at the moment seems to be, which usually portrays early medieval Ireland in the pre-Viking period, at least from a military perspective, as being a closed system without the sort of outside pressure that the rest of Europe seemed to be experiencing during the collapse of the Roman Empire that came along with the migration and invasions of outside peoples during the sort of fall of Rome. And because of this, Ireland is traditionally thought to have sort of lacked the tactical and technical developments that are seen elsewhere in Europe during the sort of shift from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, resulting in a style of warfare that was particularly low stakes, sort of focused around cattle raiding, which is sometimes seen as almost like a sort of gentlemanly sport amongst the warrior aristocracy, and that sort of the Viking invasions, with their sort of military superiority, acted as almost a shock treatment to this closed Irish system and forced Ireland into sort of the rest of the developments. However, there's lots of reasons to sort of challenge this orthodox view. One of the biggest ones is, at least according to the historical sources, like the Irish annals, the Vikings didn't actually do a lot of winning during their invasions. And from there, that sort of got me into thinking sort of what other evidence can we use to challenge that assumption of the Viking superiority in the initial phases. So first, I'm going to talk about some skeletal data that sort of refutes this idea of Irish warfare being particularly low stakes. Because when we look at the rates of skeletal trauma in Ireland, it's actually might suggest the opposite. So for instance, a couple of years ago, there was an analysis of the burial data from the Pictish Northumbrian border in what's now southern Scotland. And in that study, they estimated that about 12% of the bodies showed evidence of perimortem weapon skeletal trauma, which is the fancy way of saying, a blow from a sword or a spear or axe or whatever it is, sort of hitting deep enough to show a clear cut mark into the bones. And while this analysis didn't actually sort of give the numbers for the statistics outside of this border area, they noted that 12% seemed like it was elevated, and that this was an area of particular frequent or particular harsh conflicts. In contrast, when we look at sort of Ireland as a whole, about 13% of all burials show evidence of skeletal trauma, and at a site of Owen Bristy in, I believe, County Galway, one of the more elevated sites in Ireland, that was up to 18%. So again, rather than being low stakes, it would seem that the sort of pre-Viking, early medieval population of Ireland was more prone to weapon violence than outside of Ireland. There's also an abnormality, a developmental abnormality in the scapula, which is your shoulder blade, that again appears with some frequency, about 11% of the adult male population at Owen Bristy. This has tentatively been linked to sort of military activity. This abnormality is caused by sort of vigorous exercise using the back and shoulder that sort of stops the bones from fusing properly. However, I find this sort of less convincing, so I'm going to skip over that to save a bit of time. So the orthodox view of early medieval Irish weapons, and swords in particular, is that they were underdeveloped, physically small, and sort of lacking behind technologically. Again, possibly due to a lack of engagement with sort of the longer Spatha-style swords that were becoming popular during the late Roman Empire. And as a result, they were unable to perform sort of significant deadly strikes against opponents. So if you're coming from a more literary background, you might be familiar with the illustration I've included here from J.P. Mallory's Swords of the Ulster Cycle, where he suggests that it wasn't until the introduction of Viking swords that you were able to perform some of those feats that are described in the heroic literature, notably the decapitation of a still living opponent with a single sword strike. And this is, again, based off of the orthodox chronology of pre-Viking swords, which is best summarized by the scholar Etienne Rin in the 1980s, who suggests the ultimate Latin-style swords based off of short swords were in use in the late Iron Age up until, again, the sort of late Iron Age, early medieval transition around AD 400. And again, very much based off of sort of a short sword type rather than the sort of Celtic longsword that we might be more familiar with. So these are almost always under 60 centimeters total length. And then in the early 5th century, we get the introduction of sub-Roman swords. These are being based off of late Roman spatha and semi-spatha. That Rin suggests were introduced again around AD 400, still tending to be under 60 centimeters total length. And he doesn't sort of give an estimate to the end date, but we know it has to be at least into the early 7th century as they appear in some 7th century contexts at Ligor Crannog. And then in the 7th century, we have a bit of an explosion of sort of creativity in sword design, with the grooved swords appearing approximately AD 650, which Rin sees as a sort of abandoned experiment where they're adopting some of the influence from the Germanic world, including a blade with a fuller, which is sort of a groove down the center, rather than the midrib that's prominent in the sub-Roman examples. There's also the creation of the expanded end swords, which are significantly larger than other pre-Viking Irish swords, but still small by a non-Irish standard. I think the longest one gets to about 67 centimeters total length. They're also significantly broader, sometimes twice as broad at the hilt than the other Irish swords, and as the name suggests, widening out towards the point. And then at the and towards the end of the 7th century, we get the development of Crannog swords, which are seen as sort of a scaling back of the design of the expanded end swords, and sort of bringing it more in line as almost like a halfway point between the expanded end swords and the sub-Roman swords. And Rin suggests these were probably in use until the Viking invasions. However, this chronology has started to come into trouble in the 40 years sort of since Rin's initial proposition. Um, Notably that the what's now sometimes a bit more kindly called Hiberno-Roman rather than sub-Roman swords likely date to the Iron Age, which also means they're probably not quite as sort of low quality as was initially suspected. The Crannog sword seems to end in the 7th century rather than begin, as well as just a stronger amount of Germanic influence than Rin wanted to suggest, as well as some ambiguity in the dating of Hiberno-Norse swords that are traditionally put in the Viking Age. So to sort of go through each of these points in turn, the Hiberno-Roman swords, as I mentioned, were largely dated to the end of the Roman period, because at the time it was thought the greatest amount of contact between Ireland and Rome came with Ireland's colonization and raiding into Roman Britain, and to a lesser extent Gaul. However, in the years since then, we've found more evidence for contact between Ireland and early imperial Rome. And once we sort of open up the question to ask, well, what period are these swords most resembling specifically, then they do seem to be early imperial. So we have a photograph here of two sub-Roman Irish swords that are being compared to the Type 3 Roman hilt fittings, which date to the 1st, 2nd century, and indeed these seem to be almost identical to 1st and 2nd century Roman swords rather than late Roman swords. And if we accept an earlier date to these Hiberno-Roman swords, then rather than being small, underdeveloped versions of a late Roman sword, they in fact seem to be very comparable to the contemporary Roman examples, such as you see here at the with the sub-Roman Derrymore sword, as well as a Ultimate Latin style sword compared to an Imperial Roman gladius. The Crannog swords, like I mentioned, have been found in 7th century context at Ligor Crannog. And Rin suggested that they were probably in use until the until the start of the Viking period, because that was sort of the last sword from a datable context that had been found. And so we suggested this will have turned up in later contexts. However, with the 40 years since that suggestion, we still haven't actually had any Crannog swords arrive in a post-7th century context. which causes a bit of another problem as well, in that with the sort of traditional dating scheme of Irish swords, with the Crannog swords ending in the 7th century alongside expanded end and grooved examples, we don't actually have any known sword types to put us in the immediate pre-Viking period. However, if we accept a stronger Germanic influence than Rin wanted to, this sort of resolves itself. So here we have an illustration of some stray finds from Lagor Crannog, and you can see a lot of what is sometimes in the Irish literature called single-edged swords, but they are almost exactly matching scramsaxes, which are a type of single-edged fighting and hunting knife seen on the continent and in Britain. And specifically, these are generally compared to examples found in the 6th to 9th century, giving us one possible sword type to sort of put us in with a bit of Germanic influence in the pre-Viking period. Also, sort of outside of swords, there's a lot of interesting Germanic weaponry that's been found in Ireland, sort of gets brushed under the rug, such as this Francisca that was found in an undated context in the Lagor Crannog area, but based off of sort of the finds of datable Francisca outside of Ireland would probably be to the 7th century or earlier. To my knowledge, this is the only such object found in Ireland. However, the most common weapon in the early Middle Ages was the spear, and spears also do tend to show some Germanic influence from the 6th century onwards, such as a sort of decorative element, which is putting sort of an octagonal outside to the collar of the spear, which is where the iron spearhead meets and joins onto the spear shaft, as well as what are sometimes what's usually called lunate impression spears, sometimes called corrugated spears, which in essence have a sort of double fuller on the blade of the spear. Um, and again, those appear in Ireland in the about sometime after sort of the 6th, 7th century, and have traditionally in Ireland been attributed to Germanic influence, such as by the archaeologist B.G. Scott. However, there is a sort of as it is in those spears, because when we read about them in from Anglo-Saxon sources, scholars tend to point the finger at us and say that this is Celtic influence on Germanic weaponry. So we don't know quite how this is originating, but it does seem to be a sort of weapon type unique to Northern Europe, found both in Ireland, Britain, and Scandinavia. We can also see this a little bit in a technological level with what I'm going to call sort of pseudo pattern welding, where you have layers of different types of iron, so what we might call iron and steel, sort of forged together to make a single object, although not sort of folded onto itself to make the nice patterns we traditionally associate with pattern welding. So for instance, we have it on one spear from Tomb, and which is from either a late pre-Viking or very early Viking context, as well as a knife from Ballywee Rath, which is much more substantially dated into a pre-Viking context. Both of those are County Antrim. And then also in sort of the sort of stronger Germanic influence, we have an ambiguity of dating to certain Hiberno-Norse swords, as the name suggests, traditionally dated to the Viking period. So in particular, I want to talk about these two objects here. One is the sword from Mesquiten, County Limerick, which we have the photograph of, and one is the sword from the Recorb, County Galway, which no photographs that I've been able to find, but we do have that wonderful long line drawing from. So the Mesquiten sword has traditionally been accepted as an early Viking sword, Peterson Type A, which is sort of the earliest style of Scandinavian swords during the Viking period. However, by Peterson's own admission, the sort of turn at the end of the pommel and at the end of the crossguard are atypical. And he suggested this might be a sort of weird insular development happening in Ireland. However, if we don't start with the assumption that the sword is Viking, it in fact best resembles the Bearmer Type 8 sword, which comes from a chronology of pre-Viking Germanic swords. So that is a Frankish style of sword, particularly found in what's now modern Germany, dating around AD 600 to 750. And as you can see by the sort of comparison photo there of a more traditional Bearmer Type 8 sword, those sort of upturns at the guard and the pommel would no longer be atypical, but rather distinctive. So this again seems very likely to be a pre-Viking Frankish sword rather than a Viking sword. The sword contains a sort of shallow fuller running the length of the blade and a square tang, and is much longer than sort of other accepted pre-Viking swords at a total length of 90 centimeters. The sword from the Korab, lacking any hilt components, has so far been unclassified, but has traditionally been dated to the 9th or 10th century, based off of the idea that it best resembles post-Viking swords rather than pre-Viking swords, with its long, shallow groove, flat rectangular trang, and a longer length at a total of 75.5 centimeters. However, with the acceptance of the Askeaton sword, none of those would seem to be diagnostically post-Viking. And even if we sort of ignore that, it's just sort of combining elements we see in other pre-Viking swords, such as the flat rectangular groove we see on some expanded end, or the flat rectangular tang seen on some expanded end swords, as well as the groove found on grooved swords. So nothing about this is diagnostically Viking. So while it still lacks a firm dating evidence and we can't positively say it's pre-Viking, it does sort of have to be readdressed as a possible pre-Viking sword. So with those sort of Hiberno-Norse swords, I think we really need to reconsider their dating, in that a lot of these swords lack a firm evidence to put them in a post-Viking context, as well as other issues, such as it's based on an assumption of a lack of Germanic influence, even though we have evidence of that influence from about AD 500 onwards. Swords in this traditional dating scheme would also be technologically behind other weapons in Ireland, with lacking things like that pseudo pattern welding, unless we accept sort of this redating of the Askeaton sword, as well as just putting our filling that gap of traditional double-edged swords in the immediate pre-Viking period. So while we do have to sort of be tentative about this, I do think that reclassifying some of these Hiberno-Norse swords as pre-Viking solves more problems than it creates. And from this, we might create a new chronology and typology of early medieval Irish swords, with the Hiberno-Roman swords coming in again by at least the 2nd century and lasting until around 600 to appear at places like Lacor. The expanded end and Crannog swords both ending rather than beginning in the 7th century, and then Germanic influence swords appearing from AD sort of 500 onwards with our single-edged swords, as well as what I'm going to title early spatulate swords, essentially the grooved swords, but I want to sort of rename it to include at least one possible non-grooved example that I had to cut from time. And the early spatulate until around AD 650 would fit that sort of traditional grooved sword understanding, and late spatulate swords appearing from the 7th century onwards, being a little bit longer and with more sort of technological advancements, such as seen in the River Corrib sword. And based off of this, I would say that the aristocratic sort of warrior elites in Ireland were in constant contact with their social peers and equivalents in Britain and the continent, including in military matters, and that the Irish military technology of the pre-Viking period was keeping up with contemporary developments seen elsewhere, with possibly a possible affinity towards Merovingian Gaul. And that early medieval Irish warfare was, again, keeping up with the trends seen in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And that sort of the Vikings, rather than being a massive sort of influential shock treatment, bringing Ireland out of their sort of low stakes insular type of warfare, was just sort of a little boost in this Germanic influence. And with that, thank you.